Welcome to the Asbestos Knowledge Empire.
What does asbestos management mean to you?
I used to really struggle with the asbestos management at my site, but now it's a breeze.
It used to be really expensive. I was paying loads, but now I've got my asbestos power team in place. It's so much easier.
Asbestos can be a pain in the arse if not handled right.
We had to stop the job because asbestos was discovered. Now we don't have that problem.
Asbestos management is easier than you think. Asbestos management. Be proactive, not reactive. Think about asbestos first, not last.
And now your hosts, best-selling authors and asbestos experts, Ian Stone and Neil Munro.
Welcome to the Asbestos Knowledge Empire. I'm Ian Stone.
I'm Neil Munro.
So today we're talking about what to do when you find high-risk asbestos on site. So this week, a couple of our surveyors have been surveying a hospital and they've identified a load of asbestos insulation in a loft void and ceiling void, really, above some offices. And it's quite bad. It's like literally everywhere. It's caked. There's an original mixing bucket in the loft void of where the original workers would have actually mixed it to put it on. That's still in there with like the little, what's it called? Like a pestle and mortar type thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And also they've written their names in asbestos on the beams.
Yeah. There's significant asbestos insulation. Debris spread throughout. This is a loft void that has been accessed before. However, for some reason, it only identified asbestos insulation on parts of the pipes. It failed kind of the previous surveys that they'd had, failed to kind of identify, like Ian said, all the insulation that had been smeared and
fell off.
Even written their names onto the timbers in the loft void, which, again, I don't know if those people will still be around today. No. It does, yeah, there's significant sort of historical asbestos that has been present within these loft voids. With significant underneath the existing fiberglass insulation, the surveyors kind of lifted up the fiberglass insulation, the rolls of stuff that's sort of sitting on top of the old ceiling, and there's significant debris underneath that as well. And the real issue with this is, because it's an old lath and plaster ceiling, it hasn't been maintained. It's kind of holes, gaps present within that sort of redundant ceiling. And then there's a secondary sort of modern suspended ceiling that's present below that as well.
That's kind of the saving grace for it, really, isn't it? The fact that there's the secondary ceiling below, which does create that kind of buffer. Because if it was just the original ceiling, showing from what the guys have sent the photos wise, then asbestos would be falling down directly into that room below.
Yeah, I suppose it creates a kind of a barrier. The trouble with suspended ceilings, they are quite light. The tiles are light. They're not completely always sealed, like in a full seal. They can be kind of loose, and it's easy to kind of access those areas as well if you've got maintenance people or even just staff. It's easy just to pop a tile up and have a look within the ceiling void if you wanted to, and particularly from a maintenance point of view as well. That's the purpose of these suspended ceilings. It's
you throw all the services through it, and it gives you that area to kind of utilise, really.
Yeah. But again, it's not 100% airtight.
No, it's not a proper seal, is it? What I mean by saving grace is the fact of it will have stopped the big bits falling through old sort of ceiling roses and things like that.
Yeah, because this particular site is it's an office. It's literally below all this below is an office. So
the thing is, we find this quite a lot more often than I think people would think. When we go to a site and we discover asbestos that's not identified before. And like you said, they thought they had, we've got a little bit of pipe insulation in that loft void at one end. Yeah. And that was about it for the site. However, I mean, the guys have only been on site for 4 days this week, and we've already discovered quite a lot of stuff now that hasn't ever been identified before. And we're going to have to break the news to the client. I think they're going to be surprised over this. But for us on the other side, this isn't an uncommon thing. I mean, there's been several times in my career where I've spoken to estates department or managers of a building and we've gone to survey them and they've said, oh yeah, no, there's nothing here. You won't find anything. We've had it checked before. Yeah. I've had a look around. No, there's definitely nothing here. And then you do find asbestos. And a lot of the times, because that's kind of the attitude as well, you then find, I haven't got a problem. So then we actually, when we go and look, we actually find a bigger problem. They've been telling people for years, there's nothing here. And I don't know, sparkies, plumbers, things like that, they just go and crack on off of that notion that there's no asbestos there, rightly or wrongly. I mean, if they've had a survey done and they've missed it, well, fair enough. It's kind of like, well, look, we haven't got any asbestos here because we've got a bit of proof. Yeah. But that's obviously kind of bad workmanship from the previous surveys. But
this is worse when you've kind of got, you look to the left, there's a pipe, and then right underneath it or right next to it, there's debris. Always just amazes me. It's kind of, you found that, but then you actually didn't look.
And it's not new. It's not like, it only fell off last week. No. It's been there donkey's years. You can just see.
Yeah, exactly. And there's significant underneath the fiberglass. But even that, it's it's all smeared all over the timbers. So you've got in a loft void. When you walk in a loft, the timbers are in your face.
I think probably this goes back to another podcast that we did about complacency being the surveyor's kind of worst enemy, in the fact of you get complacent, you start thinking you know what you're going to find and all the rest of it, and it comes back to bite you. And that's probably the scenario with this one, that the surveyor got excited over the fact, I found this insulation, sampled it, photographed it, marked it on their plans, and then thought their job was done.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, do you know what I mean? It's like,
perhaps they didn't have the right equipment to access it correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's all manner of, we'll never know why.
No.
There's all manner of kind of excuses, I suppose, you can come up with. But essentially there's obviously a significant time period of when this insulation first went in and to this current day, it's in this state. So, loft voids are not accessed probably on a day-to-day basis. But usually services go through loft voids, and services in particular, especially in commercial areas, they have to be maintained, don't they? Usually you get water tanks or definitely electrical or pipe work running through the loft. So there would have been people that have accessed this over the years, and we're talking years.
Yeah, there's definitely exposures that will have occurred and will have happened to people working in there.
And the significant damage to these materials, would warrant, significant fibre release. Yeah. And even just entering these loft voids has a potential to, create airborne asbestos fibre, just from the nature of the damage to these materials. So it is significant risk. So I suppose kind of talk about what
we're doing next. Yeah, and that's it. So the way we've handled this situation is it's an office that's occupied by a few people below. We've shut down access to that loft void and into that ceiling void. It's now a permit to work area. Nobody can access that whatsoever. And we've also carried out air monitoring throughout that area to determine if there has been and what the ambient background fibre levels are within that area. Now, when we've done the analysis, the results are less than what we need, which is great. Yeah. And like I say from earlier, I think the saving grace for the people in that office is the fact that they've got that suspended ceiling above, which has kind of produced that buffer zone for large debris and large amounts of fibre to be released from the actual loft void above.
I think it's an important thing to check is kind of in this scenario whether there's any air movement in these areas, if there's any kind of air conditioning or ventilation that's going to kind of disturb the airflow within these areas, because that's kind of going to cause the risk to any sort of occupants, as if there's any airflow, particularly through the voids or through the loft. In this scenario, there isn't. It's quite a static ceiling void and loft void, so there isn't any air movement. But that is definitely something to double check, because that potentially could be blowing asbestos fibre.
Exactly that. I mean, we're carrying out air monitoring over a number of days, so we pull the actual results rather than just one snapshot. We're taking several over several times throughout the day to make sure that people can go back in and work safely or not. And if it's not, fine. At least we've got the information that we know, and we can then help and advise the client kind of how to get this situation resolved. Just one thing on airflow and air movement. You mentioned aircon. Definitely that is a biggie that creates it and generates it. I mean, some suspended ceilings are rubbish. And like you said earlier, when you kind of, they pop easy because they're not sitting in the grid properly. I remember an office that we worked in, you would look, the window would be open, or somebody had opened the door and the ceiling grid lifts. Yeah, it kind of jumped, didn't it? And again, it's those scenarios that you need to consider, because when you're in there and the door's shut, everything's okay. But then, well, what happens when you open the window? What happens when you open the door?
Exactly.
You have these stupid things that happen that you don't consider.
Yeah. And definitely, because particularly this kind of time of year where the temperature's starting to change, people's activities change, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
You know, you go from having the windows open to shutting them, putting the aircon on.
You have Heatergate, don't you, as well?
Exactly that.
So-and-so down the end of the office is hot, so they open the window. So-and-so down the other end of the office is cold, so they whack the heating up. Yeah. And then, like you say, that can generate air movement and things like that throughout the building.
Yeah, but you'll know that, you know, as you're building, you know you're building more than anyone, and it's kind of having to think about those scenarios and any changes that are going to potentially come into play as a kind of the temperatures do change and the activities in the building change as well, because that would definitely have a knock-on effect to how that's safely contained within this ceiling void. You may even need to consider, you know, sealing any kind of gaps to the suspended ceiling, maybe particularly around light fittings or, you know, any replacement tiles, because sometimes a suspended ceiling, when it's installed, is usually every tile's clipped down. But over the years, through maintenance, you know, people just ping the clips off and the tiles then sit loose.
Yeah, well, that's it, because you can only put the tiles on like once it's installed, because they start in one corner and work back.
Yeah.
And then they all get put on. So once you've, like you say, pinged the clips off because you've popped a tile in the middle of the room, it's impossible for you to get them back on unless you take all the tiles off in a row and then put them all back on, which nobody does.
No, it's just too much hassle.
So at the moment, it's looking, like we're saying, that the results that we've had are looking like it is a safe area, as long as nothing changes. However, long term, the client's going to have to deal with this. And we're kind of having chats at the moment, just discussing solutions and options. And like
best course of action.
We're going to look at everything from sealing the area off completely, whether that is viable or not, through to, well, can we make it safe, or does it need to be fully removed?
Yeah. And that will kind of depend on, you know, what access do they need into this area? Because essentially, you know, if you restrict access, you kind of like, it's a no-go zone. And a no-go zone is not always practicable if you've got stuff in there that you need to get access to, whether that be for maintenance purposes. You know, you might have water tanks, electrics, even just pipes as well. If you get a leak in a pipe, what do you do? Yeah. It's kind of taking all those scenarios into play, isn't it? And trying to come up with your best solution that, one, meets your budget, because let's be honest, decontaminating a loft void, even if you can get it 100%, is not going to be cheap.
No, it's not.
And sometimes, you know,
it's a difficult job.
Yeah, you can't get it 100%.
No, it really is a difficult job, and especially this one, because we're talking about the actual loft void and the ceiling void below. If we do move forwards with removal, it is going to be a removal of the lath and plaster ceiling. It will be removal of the suspended ceiling below. Obviously, you've got to decamp everything out of the office below that to make it a safe working area. It's under fully controlled conditions. The eaves of the roof are very small and tight and cramped. So a lot of thought and process needs to go into how are they going to be accessed? How is the contractor going to clean them properly and appropriately? And also structurally as well. Yeah. There's a lot of things to consider with this project.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to what we kind of always bang on about is getting the right specification for you, and how that's going to help you and manage this asbestos risk in the future. It may be the case that you need to get to one section of the loft.
Yeah.
And you can live with it being completely mothballed and boarded out and sealed. So yeah, it all really just depends on
you and how the building works.
And the specification is then written to your wants.
Yeah.
Basically.
I suppose the biggest takeaway from this podcast is if asbestos is found, then it's kind of the next step is to risk assess it. And part of the risk assessment is having air monitoring done. And that's what I kind of wanted to get over today is you've found asbestos, it's in a bad condition. There are people in and around that vicinity. The best foot forward is to have air monitoring done, because then that gives you that background evidence, that proof of what is in the air. Has it spread? Because without actually doing that, you don't know. You'll kind of just think, well, everybody's safe because I've shut the boiler room door. But I don't know. I mean, maintenance departments, the caretaker's office is next to the boiler room a lot of the times in schools. Yeah. And it's like, well, okay, it's safe, but how long has that door been open? It's damaged. How long has somebody walked in and brushed past it and disturbed it? So having air monitoring as kind of part of that overall risk assessment to see where you're at is really one of the first ports of call.
Yeah, definitely. It gives you that snapshot at the time, doesn't it? And you can build. That's why Ian said, like, one is kind of never enough, really, because, like I said, the air monitoring just gives you a snapshot at that time. However, the conditions may change depending on what's happening, the activities in that area. So it is kind of, if you want to build up the evidence in your case to prove that people are not being exposed, one's kind of never really enough.
No, it's not, and like it needs to be throughout the normal occupancy of that area, which is when the cleaners go. I mean, for an office, when the cleaners go in, when the office is, it's got 2 people in, when there's 20 in there, when the site guys come back in to do training. It's kind of all of these scenarios with different people produce different effects within that room. Yeah. I mean, if you look at, think of a factory, for instance. If there was an incident at a factory where asbestos has been disturbed, the area's sealed off and we're called in. And a lot of the times we're called in when nobody else is in there because everybody's been told, right, stay away, all the rest of it. So we'll go in, we'll do our air monitoring. Everything appears okay. However, the next day, 2,000 people are in that factory. Machines are working. There's noise. There's kind of thud and thumps from machines going on and all the rest of it. And it's like, well, if we only did it the day before, then that is a completely different result you're going to get than the day after when everybody goes back in.
Yeah, yeah. And to kind of build up to that, it's a good idea to kind of build up to that. So, for instance, if you have got a concern over asbestos and damaged asbestos, is yes, have the air monitoring done when the area is unoccupied to see what the levels are, but then build up. So you could ask your asbestos consultant to replicate potential activities within that area as a matter of caution before you obviously go and let everyone back in. Exactly. It's kind of building that evidence up to that point, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're safe to do that because we would wear appropriate respirators, coveralls, decontaminate, all the rest of it. So yeah, that's the long and short of the podcast, really. If you have got asbestos that's damaged in a condition or something's identified, something happens, do strongly consider having air monitoring done as well, because like you say, that builds up that level of proof and it can help identify which is going to be the best course of action for you.
Yeah, it can help you evaluate what you really need to do and how quickly you need to do it as well. I hope you found that useful. Remember, asbestos first, not last.